This is E&P Reports, a vodcast from Editor and Publisher Magazine, the authoritative voice of news media since 1884, serving newspapers, broadcast, digital, and all forms of news publishing.
And greetings again, Mike Blinder, publisher, E&P Magazine. As always, we urge our audience who's listening on a podcast platform to follow, watching on YouTube. There is a subscribe button below, a bell to the right. Hit those puppies. You'll get an update each and every time we upload a new episode of this weekly vodcast series dedicated to informing on the news media industry. We call it E&P Reports. I have two old friends who have both been on the program twice. I always go back and look. No jacket till 5 times, Steven. Steven Waldman, CEO, founder, Rebuild Local News. Steven, you've been there 4 years. You're also a co-founder. I'm still on the board for Report for America. That was 7 years. You did stints at the FCC, Pew, co-founder of BeliefNet. That would be an interesting story just in itself. And of course, you really cut your chops and made your bones as a Washington correspondent for Newsweek and States News Service. Do I have that right, sir?
Yes.
I mean, so you have a little ink in your veins, right? Working the beats and writing and all that and more.
I started out as a hack political legacy journalist.
There you go. Jeff Jarvis, you're the smart one. Well, I didn't mean that disparagingly, because you're a professor, director, Cal Knight Center for Entrepreneurial Journalism at the Newmark Graduate School at CUNY. You've been there for 17 years, Jeff. What, you started when you were 12?
But I'm also leaving and air quotes retiring.
Oh, wow. Air quotes.
Yep.
You'll never.
I'll be going somewhere else to do something new. It's be announced yet.
You did write, and you still write. You write for Guardian, Buzz Machine. We're going to talk about what you wrote for Buzz Machine in a few minutes. But you kicked your journalism career off in San Francisco with the Examiner. Is that right?
No, I'm much older than that. I go back to, besides the brilliant Iowa Hawkeye, Iowa's largest paper because it had the biggest web size. That was an internship. Chicago Today, the paper that had no tomorrow, then to the Tribune, then the San Francisco Examiner, the New York Daily News, Time Inc., People, Entertainment Weekly, and then onward.
There you go.
So I too have ink and slick paper
in your veins. The topic today is going to be kind of remember the good old days of Shane and Menaker, whatever, point, counterpoint, back when 60 Minutes used to do that. There was a recent article that, Stephen, thank you for publishing it with us, the E&P, where you actually mentioned Jeff and talk about the article he posted in BuzzFeed. And this is, Buzz Machine, I should say. And it's an interesting topic where it's both of you are pro-journalism. Let me get that right. No one's on this show is going to say we don't need that final check on power in our democracy. But in your article, Jeff, you kind of said maybe it's time for legacy media just to pass away. And Steve, your article was in defense of helping, quote, some old media survive. So that is the topic today. And we're going to discuss it with two very smart, very well-known industry leaders on the backside of this message.
This episode of E&P Reports is exclusively sponsored by Blocks Digital, formerly Town News. Even though the name has changed, their commitment to the media industry is as strong as ever. Blocks Digital is now even better positioned to deliver integrated solutions like content management, audience development, advertising revenue, video management, and more. Join the over 2,000 news publishers worldwide that power their ongoing digital transformation with Blocks Digital, serving over 141 million monthly users who view over 6.5 billion pages of content each year. You can trust Blocks Digital to empower you, to connect you at scale with the community you need to reach. Blocks Digital, formerly Town News, now reimagined to help meet the news publishing challenges of tomorrow and beyond. Learn more at blocksdigital.com.
Okay, let's start with Jeff. Jeff, your piece was interesting. You basically reacted to the LA Times. Is that what, the massive layoff of a quarter of the team at the LA Times that was just about a month ago. And And you basically said maybe it's just time to let legacy pass. Is that pretty much what your view was when you wrote this piece, Jeff?
I wouldn't say is in direct response to that. It's more like carbon monoxide building up in the blood over time. Stephen and I will agree to your frustration a lot more than we will disagree. We're both trying to figure out what to do here. And I spent 15 years running a Center for Entrepreneurial Journalism, most of the time worrying about legacy media. But at this point, when you see that most chains in the US are controlled or owned by hedge funds that are not going to invest in or innovate in news, or owners like Patrick Soon-Shiong at the LA Times, who has not had a successful run, I would say, so far. It makes me wonder whether or not we should throw good money and effort after bad with those entities. Now, there are plenty of exceptions. I worked for Advance, and Advance is doing pretty well right now. There's the Minneapolis Star Tribune, there's the Boston Globe. As Stephen points out in his piece, there are lots and lots of small and newer entities that are doing well. But what I'm saying is that I think that the industry, which is dominated by these big companies, which are in turn dominated by hedge funds, which are lobbying in Washington and in Sacramento for protectionist legislation, shouldn't be the core of the industry anymore, shouldn't be who we're worried about anymore. It needs to be, I think, the innovators and the new efforts, and that they're not worth the effort. They're doing more damage than good these days.
Stephen, in response to that.
Well, I agree with part of that, but my point is that the term legacy media and our conception of legacy media needs to be made more precise, and that we need to really think about the different parts of legacy media. Legacy media includes Black and Hispanic newspapers, almost all of which are legacy media. Most ethnic media is. It includes family-owned rural weeklies. It includes billionaire-owned dailies in Boston and Minneapolis. It includes big corporate chains and chains owned by hedge funds and private equity firms. That's all part of the legacy media landscape. I generally agree with Jeff's critique of hedge fund-owned newspapers. Like, there's pretty strong evidence at this point. It's not just anecdotal that when hedge funds take over newspapers, they are not interested in building, they're not interested in innovating, they're interested in sucking them dry. And it's a real big part of our problem right now, that half of the daily newspaper circulation in America right now is owned by a hedge fund. And I always say, like, any attempts to try to deal with public policy or anything else that ignores that fact is missing a pretty big part of the equation. But there's 7,000 local news organizations. If you say, like, the other half represents 3,500 entities, or there's thousands of entities that are independent or smaller or in the zone of things that we don't want to just write off, and the entire innovation sector, the total number of nonprofits, which I love and I'm a big booster of, is about 400. So the number of so-called good legacy media organizations is still enormous, and many of those folks are working day and night to make it work and serve their communities and innovate in their own way as best they can. So I think that both philanthropic, but more importantly public policy, should figure out ways, if possible, to help that part of legacy media while not subsidizing the parts of legacy media that are it's not just that they're not doing well, it's that their business model is sometimes almost actively harmful.
Well, let's assume that Penny Abernathy knows what she's saying. Jeff, you know the euphemisms out there now. I mean, we got their news deserts, we got the ghost papers and all that and more. But Jeff, Penny Abernathy has put out research now, we always call it the news desert report now, that shows that when a town doesn't have a voice, it languishes. People don't vote. There's corruption that builds. Do you agree with that, Jeff? I mean that.
So I just came back from a trip to
voice.
Scranton. I just came back from a trip to Scranton, PA,
Right,
where the newspaper was just bought by Alden.
yes,
And the town is very upset for good reason. And we know what's going to happen there. And the public broadcasting station there is very innovative and is very open to collaboration. And what I want to do, and I want to follow up and see what happens there. Can we build something? Can they build something that's good for the future of Scranton? I think the real thing that I'd like to focus in on, because I think Stephen and I are going to, and you are going to agree about the larger goals here. How do we help innovation? How do we help good entities? How do we not let the bad entities, the hedge fund owned entities, rule this debate? And I would say there's three things. One is when I see efforts, and Stephen has a lot of very innovative ideas for government involvement in helping subsidize news in various ways, and he can tell you about that. My friend Chris Daggett runs the consortium here in New Jersey that's gotten New Jersey funds, and I think has handed out $11 million so far. So there's good efforts there. I've got two questions about this. One, how do we deal at a local level with what I would say is a good state like New Jersey, where and come up with rules and structures for government involvement in news that is not then corrupted in places like Texas and Florida? I think it's a great challenge, because what would be supported and what support would be withdrawn from what kinds of outlets in those places is a very real concern. Second, if you look at national efforts and local efforts, you look at the JCPA and CJPA, similar legislation happening at a federal and California level. They want to help entities that are above 100,000, which means that leaves out tons of the people that Stephen just talked about. And it will end up helping the hedge funds oftentimes. Or in the case of California's, it'll end up helping right-wing media, national media, and others. So that's the second problem. How do you, one, deal with bad, malign political actors? Number two, how do you help the good guys and not the bad guys at the same time and come up with rule sets that do both things? And then number three, how do we recognize that journalism has a bigger problem? It's not a business model problem. Our trust has been falling since the 70s. Reuters Institute says a third of people around the world are now actively avoiding news. We've got to do more than think that we want to support the news that was. We've got to invent the news that will be. That's why I teach, is in the hopes of getting students to learn what we teach them and then question what we teach them, question how we got where we are, and reinvent news and journalism in a fundamentally new way. One last point. When I was in Scranton, I was thinking about it afterwards. It was a really good conversation. I spoke at the University of Scranton to mainly townspeople and journalists and the former owner of the paper who was devastated when his family chose to sell to Alden. We still talk about the journalism. It's still a journalism-focused discussion. And I failed at getting it to be a community-focused discussion. And so I think we've got to change this discussion about journalism generally to the, and Stephen, I'm sure will agree with this, to the health, the information health of the communities, rather than concentrating on how we try to protect the journalism that was.
Stephen,
yeah, well, I totally agree with that last part. I mean, my one-liner whenever I get, if anyone asks advice about, what to do in a community, is start thinking of yourself as a community institution whose goal is to serve the community, not as a publisher of information.
Amen, brother.
Okay, well, Stephen,
and once you do that, it takes you in different places. But the main thing I would say is that it is not only new entities that can think anew. Old entities, existing entities, sometimes can also think anew and recreate journalism. We have plenty of examples. I'm not going to claim that they're the majority or, as much as there should be, but there's lots. And that I think is really, maybe the only area where we disagree is I think that legacy entities can't be written off, and we have to figure out ways of getting the folks that want to reorient to do so. And in Pennsylvania, there's a great counterexample to this. Well, first of all, in terms of Scranton, here's a little public policy thing that I'm not going to say this is going to revolutionize everything, but how about we have a 120-day waiting period before any newspaper can sell to an out-of-state company, so that at least there's a little bit of a chance for local communities to try to acquire a publication. But the other thing that's happened in Pennsylvania is the public radio station buying the newspaper in Lancaster.
Yes.
That's a legacy newspaper. And when I say, we can't give up on legacy newspapers, I don't mean we should preserve legacy newspapers and their ownership structures as they have been in the past. Like, part of what has to happen in order for legacy newspapers to succeed in a lot of cases is for the ownership structures to change. So there you have a situation where you have a merger of a public radio station, a family-owned newspaper, with a foundation coming in to help lubricate reform and digital transformation. That's a really interesting model.
But Steven, when you and I worked on a project together exploring Pulaski, Tennessee, a town here in the state I live in where the KKK formed, and we had the mayor on a program that you helped us work on together. And that mayor, who was about as far right as you can get, was upset when his town lost its paper for a few weeks, and another owner swooped in and saved the town from languishing. In other words, that's a town I worry about. Does this make sense? I mean, how do
yeah, and I would even, stepping back one level of generality, I would say the amount of money and attention that's gone to national media is all, like, I'm not worried about I'm worried about national media, but not because of business model reasons. The messenger will go away, will be fine. Like, it's not that there's any shortage of national media. That's not true of local media. There are thousands of communities that have nothing or very little. And so, when I saw how much money was spent on the messenger, the very first thing I did, probably self-destructively, was to figure out how many reporters in local newsrooms that could have funded if it had gone through, like, Report for America. 1,500 reporters in local newsrooms could have been funded through Report for America instead of wasting it on the messenger. And I think public policy ought to take the same attitude. Like, I know this isn't the way it's been done in other countries, but efforts to subsidize national media through public policy don't make a lot of sense to me. That's not where the crisis is.
No, so Jeff, you are in the same camp as a Ken Doctor on this. I mean, when we had Ken on this show and he finally announced the new model he had been teasing for a couple of years that he was building and incubating, he said on this very program, as he is launching it, that we didn't want to do it inside of a legacy property because the culture was bad, and we're just going to launch this project as a new entity. My business sense was upset with that, not because I want to save every damn 150-year-old masthead, but I believe once you already have an audience built and some street cred, you should try to save that first. Like Warren Buffett always said, I bought companies that were smoldering cigars that I could breathe life into. That's what we did here at E&P, a 140-year-old brand. Why let it die, Jeff, when we're the only industry that is mentioned in the Constitution as necessary for a town like Pulaski? Now, am I just not seeing the point here? Just assume that dinosaur should die and something will grow after the after the death of one that will come up in that town?
I think, again, Steve and I will agree that it varies town to town, owner to owner. But if you look at Scranton, there was a call there for the public radio station to take over the newspaper. I don't know whether that would have been the best move. I don't know whether they would have been saddled with issues that would have been difficult to deal with. It varies. I think a different model is what happened with KPCC in LAist, where the LAist has taken over the brand now, and they've rebranded the radio station LAist. I've talked to Kristen Mullen, who heads the content side, and Ariel Zaralnik, who's a brilliant person on the kind of strategy and social side, along with others. They're doing great work there. They're reorganizing the entire organization around community needs. They're listening to the community in new ways. Listen, Mike, I love newspapers. I have boxes of my clips downstairs. I loved magazines. I've got them behind me. I have an affection for that. But we've got to let loose of this loving. I'm doing a lot of research right now on a paper I'm writing on the California, the CJPA, and I came across a quote that the problem wasn't that the railroad industry thought of themselves as a transportation industry, it's that they loved the trains. So let's get over this love of the newspaper as newspaper and make some tough decisions about what is worth saving there and what isn't. Where are the assets there? Are they more valuable? Is that the way to do it? Again, with community needs number one in our focus.
All right, gentlemen, let's pivot to legislation. Let's focus on that. Recently on this program, I had Danielle Coffey of News Media Alliance, along with Paul Deegan of News Media Canada. Obviously, big news up in Canada, $100 million being agreed to for big tech compensation to local newspapers. And we were discussing the future of that similar legislation being here in the US. We had Dean Ridings on the show. Now, of course, Dean is supporting the Community News and Small Business Act. But currently in California, a lot is percolating there with similar legislation being called the California Journalism Preservation Act, the CJPA. Stephen, you're heavily involved in this. What's going on?
Our view on the CJPA is that the current bill is flawed because most of the money would actually go to national media, not California publishers.
But the intent
we have proposed
all right,
a fix for that, which would be to say that the money needs to go to California publishers and be based on headcount rather than page views. And we've proposed other ways at this that aren't through the bargaining code structure. So we've put out a bunch of ideas that we think could work. But that's a good example, like having a California policy where most of the money goes to national magazine publishers. It doesn't make a lot of sense to me. I don't think it's going to make a lot of sense to California legislators either at the end of the day. But I do have no problem at all with saying that tech companies should help pay for saving local news. And I'm not making a moral argument that they were the main cause. Well, the fleeing of advertising to the internet obviously is a main cause of the decline of local news. But I don't think it was necessarily because of malign behavior. There's some that was, but mostly they, had advertising products that businesses went to. I don't think the apportionment of what percentage of it was malicious and not malicious is that important. My view on the tech companies is that we had a digital revolution. They are the big winners. And as a matter of public policy, it is totally appropriate to ask them to help pay to repair the collateral damage. Whether or not it was done through bad motives or good motives, we have a massive crisis in local news that is causing crisis for democracy. And it is totally appropriate to ask the winners of that system to help fix it. And personally, I would probably do it through a tax on Google, Facebook, Amazon ought to be included in the discussion, and use the money for much more targeted forms of support for local news. But I've got no problem as a general matter with saying that tech companies should help pay for the helping to solve the crisis in local news.
And
that's where we'll disagree.
That's Jeff. I have to say, Jeff, you are against that.
A few things. God did not give newspaper publishers the revenue, the audience, the attention of the advertisers they had. It's not theirs by rights. And to say that a new competitor came and offered better deals to advertisers and better service to citizens and readers, live by capitalism, die by capitalism. That's the break skies. And I think that to hold up these companies, which have been willingly trying to help the news industry, Facebook and Google committed $300 million each in the time to the news industry. They were holding events that Stephen and I have gone to, like Newsgeist. They were doing training through my old school at CUNY. And full disclosure is, I've raised money for the platforms for the school. I've never been paid personally by any of the platforms. But the problem here is we can see where this is headed. What publishers are doing today, the same thing they did when radio came in, same thing they did in other media, including the R box and information services, is they keep on trying to expand copyright. That's going to have an impact on freedom of expression overall. I testified before a Senate subcommittee a few weeks ago about AI, and they're trying to expand copyright and shrink fair use so that AI cannot even read their news without paying for it, which journalists, by the way, do all the time. We used to employ scissors editors at newspapers who helped us share news as we went. So I think it's a mistake constitutionally and morally to think that one industry should buck up a dying industry, and that's mainly, again, bucking up the old guys in that industry. But more important, we can look at the recent history of this. This starts with the Leistungsschutzrecht in Germany, goes through the link tax in Spain, goes through the bargaining code in Australia, then into C18 in Canada. And that has been a bloody disaster because Facebook said, you can't force us to carry the news because there is a matter of human rights in Canada on that. Compelled speech is not free speech. So as we all know, Facebook pulled all news out of Facebook. And they've deprecated news world around. And I fear that if JCPA or CJPA passes in the US, Facebook will pull entirely out of news. In Canada, that didn't affect Facebook's traffic at all. Independent analysis shows they're fine. The news wasn't valuable to Facebook. The links that the publishers said weren't valuable were valuable to the publishers because they've lost 30% of their traffic. They're hurting. They hope to get $300 million in backsheesh out of Google. They got a third of that. In the end, everyone in Canada was hurt. The publishers, the citizens, the platforms too, were all hurt. And now we're looking to do the same thing in the US. I think this is foolhardy. Now, if there are, and again, I repeat before, I'm nervous about government involvement in journalism and speech, period. I'm open-minded to it, trying to find the models. I think Stephen's doing interesting things. I think Chris Daggett is doing interesting things. My former student, Simon Alperin, is doing interesting things. Berkeley and its fund is interesting as well. I'm open-minded to doing it, but I challenge that we've got to do it in a way that we set rule sets that do not empower fascist governments to punish liberal media or support right-wing fascist media. And we've got to do it in a way that doesn't just end up going into the pockets of Rupert Murdoch, not journalists. If you can pass those tests, I'm open to how to do this, but those are two hard tests.
Yeah, I want to, not to defend fascists or Rupert Murdoch, but I think that
that's a hell of a preamble, Steve.
Yeah.
Great way to start sentence.
I think that, first of all, would you support a tax on digital advertising among companies above a certain amount?
Why center them out? If it's a tax, it's fungible money. If you think government money should go to this, then figure out how government money goes to this. But why single out that one industry? For the same reason
that in the 70s they put a tax on oil companies to help pay for environmental issues.
You're presuming that the digital companies have done damage to news. I disagree.
No, I don't think that has to be a premise at all. I think, look, we have a progressive income tax in this country whose premise is that if you are fabulously wealthy, you should pay a little more because you've been blessed to be in this country and have all sorts of opportunities.
Then charge all billionaires that money, Stephen. If you charge all billionaires that money, then that's a fair issue. But if you're focusing on one industry,
I'd be okay with that too. But it doesn't seem crazy to me to say, the business model declined because all the revenue went to the internet. So let's tax some of the folks where the ad revenue went to help deal with this massive crisis in communities. But let's talk about the tricky problem of creating policy that goes to people that you don't like, right? Or not just you, but that one doesn't like. That's one of the hardest issues of public policy, right? Like foundations are a different thing. Like foundations can sit around, they can look under the hood, they can make really narrow, nuanced judgments about ownership and motive and planning and stuff like that. So what I'm about to say, I would not say if I were running a foundation, but I'm looking at public policy. So my sense from looking at the history here is that the best public policy on media is actually broad stroke, blunt instrument policy, not fine-tuned, let's sit around the table and discuss who gets a grant policy. The most successful policy that we've had probably was the postal subsidy that the founding fathers put in and lived for 100, 150 years at various different levels. The fact is that supported all sorts of crappy publications. And Jefferson, I'm sure had moments of thinking, oh my God, I can't believe we giving subsidies to these Federalist rags, and vice versa. But to me, it's a little bit like the charitable deduction. You're lifting up the whole floor, and you're creating a sense that it is not government officials that are picking and choosing. Now, I don't want to overstate that. Like, I don't think that therefore anyone should get everything. Like when we were doing the payroll tax credit, I supported putting a cap on it so that any individual corporation couldn't get more than a certain amount. And I would support giving more money to publications that maintain or grow staff instead of eliminating staff. So I think there are, knobs you can turn. But I think you actually have to have a certain amount of tolerance for money going to places that you might not like. Just as I have a tolerance to the fact that my tax dollars are subsidizing your crazy charitable deduction decisions, and you are doing the same for me, I don't lose sleep over it because it has a broad effect of helping the general nonprofit sector. This is a hard argument to make, I know, because like once dollars start flowing, there's going to be publications that I will cringe over the fact that they're getting taxpayer subsidy. So it's hard, but I think the alternative is actually worse, where you create government programs that with people sitting around a table deciding in a precise way who's going to get what. That's going to further erode trust. It's going to lead to more prospect for favoritism and political manipulation.
It's unconstitutional. Basically, we still have a free and unfettered press, correct? You cannot have, if you do a tax, maybe I'm being too simple here, gentlemen, but if you have a tax, that means you have to then define who gets the money, and that means you have to define what journalism is on a government level, like they've done in Canada.
That's the issue.
Go ahead.
You could just have the tax pay for the payroll tax credit, which we all, I don't know about Jeff, but Mike, you liked, right? That's the thing that's just.
I like anything right now that helps.
So tax credit, employment tax credit for local reporters. You're not making
what's a local quality. Reporter? Define it. We had Mickey Osterreicher on this program, chief counsel for the Society for Professional Journalists. He is also a sheriff in his town. Amazing. He's a lawyer and a sheriff, and he represents journalists. And he said that the police community is begging us to define who's inside the rope line now. Please tell us who's a journalist. We're begging you, because now we don't know anybody with a camera says they're a journalist. And technically that's the law, is it not? I mean, we haven't yet to do that here as a society. You say that is, I just heard Jeff here scream that certain publications don't deserve to be journalism. But in our society, we can't do that. Do I have
we can't license journalism, which becomes de facto licensing of if government decides who gets it and who doesn't. And that's my fear about Texas and Florida.
See,
they'll find ways to pull whatever subsidy away from Houston Landing and the Houston Chronicle.
They've already
and
done
give
that.
It to Crazy Joe's news pack.
In Arkansas, they already pulled money that they were using. The state college advertising fund was pulled from a paper because they didn't agree with an editorial. Yeah. It's already happened.
And by the way, we already have public notice advertising in every county in the country. There's already government support for news. And in some cases, it is being used in nefarious ways like that. But we also have to look at what the alternative is, which is, look, no one in the Rebuild Local News Coalition came with enthusiasm about the idea of government getting more involved in saving local news. It's weird that way. It's like a coalition of people who'd rather not be there. But what drove us there is that the crisis is so
sounds
severe.
like a church I used to go to. Yeah.
The crisis is so severe and the consequences so great that we need to look at things like this, because I don't think philanthropy is going to be enough.
No.
Like, Chris Ford biggest effort to raise philanthropy for local news in American history, $100 million over each year. And, every expert I've seen has said, to get our local news system back to anything that vaguely, serves the public is going to cost $2 to $3 billion a year, from combinations of philanthropy, better business models, et cetera, just as a point of scale. So I don't think philanthropy is going to be enough. And I think the crisis is so severe that we need to be looking at things. And so, yeah, there absolutely are difficulties in the payroll tax credit and how you define reporters, just as there are difficulties when foundations give out grants like that. But that, the payroll tax credit in the labor subsidy in Canada is working well. And I think we can come up with our, own version. And there are other ways that are even lighter touch, like the idea of a tax credit for small businesses that advertise in local news is interesting, because small businesses decide who they want to advertise with based on whether or not they think it's a credible publication and will meet their needs. It's sort of or a coupon for consumers.
And I'm in favor of anything that saves journalism, but allow me to take the other side of that argument. In that argument, to do this, you are stating that you are helping local businesses so they have a better way to advertise for less money. We're giving them this benefit to grow the local economy. If I ran a local outdoor company or a radio station that just plays music, I would say, hey, give me the same benefit because I can help them grow their business with advertising here. You see?
Yeah, well, that's
let's
true.
be clear.
Sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead, Steven, then Jeff, go ahead.
Well, that's true of any public policy. Like any tax credit for anything, someone else could say, we deserve that tax credit too. And in fact, when the Biden administration did massive tax credits for green energy, people who were in the non-green energy industry made that argument. Why are the green people getting that? Well, it's because we're making a decision as a society that it's valuable to encourage the development of green energy. And the collapse of local news and the importance of having community journalism is in that category of something that is a important public policy goal.
Jeff, final.
So, Mike, thank you for arguing as devil with me. I think that if you asked Facebook and Google, and to an extent Amazon and eBay and Etsy, they would all say that they've helped local business more than newspapers, which had monopoly pricing power. And nobody could have, if you had a small business, if I want to start Mike's Jam Company, I couldn't afford to advertise in any newspaper or even a local daily, even local weeklies were expensive. But I could go on and get a Google ad, or I could get a Facebook ad at a very low cost. So Facebook's out there all the time bragging about what they've done for local commerce. I think we need research to see what the real impact has been, but I think it's a legitimate point to say that if you're going to say that you're helping local business and local commerce, that there may be other better ways to do it. And you're right, it may be music radio, it may be blogs, it may be all kinds of things. And also, I'm a Joe Biden Democrat, but I'm about to sound like a Joe Scarborough libertarian here for a second, so forgive me. But I think we also have to ask at some point where the non-market intervention keeps things that otherwise wouldn't and perhaps shouldn't survive. And should department stores survive? Well, they're kind of obsolete now. Back in the day, the huge controversy in the United States over A&P, the great A&P tea company, was killing mom and pop corner grocery stores. There was legislation to get rid of chain stores, and chains were evil and chains were bad. In the long run, the customer was better served with supermarkets. And we have to, I think, ask where the market is headed in its own direction, and we're just delaying an inevitability and spending a lot of money on that delay.
I was worried about that when we did the FCC report that came out in 2011. I thought, well, we're in the middle of a disruption. Maybe it'll get fixed. And instead, it got way, way worse. And one of the things that was found in the Penny Abernathy report is that when newspapers close in rural areas, they're not replaced by new things. No. If that were different, we'd be having a different conversation. There'd be, okay, legacy media dies, but new things are arising. There's something fundamental about the economics of community news that is making this particularly difficult, and we keep going in the wrong direction. It's getting worse. You know, the percentage of newspapers that are closing is actually accelerating. So in all the years that you and I have been working on this, Jeff, the problem has gotten worse. I don't blame
if you define that as the problem
entirely, but what's that?
If you define the fate of those newspapers as the problem, that's the point.
No,
of my post
I don't
originally.
agree. I think if you define it as communities being adequately served by journalism, it's gotten way worse.
But you also have 400 plus members of the news consortium here in New Jersey. You have 400 plus members of Lion. You have 400 plus members of INN. And I know you support them all too. And there is growth in those areas.
Yes.
And so when a paper dies,
public policy should really help support that growth.
Yes, yes. And so what we see instead in the case of and I know you're not a big supporter of it, but both JCPA and CJPA is that you have to have $100,000 revenue to get the first penny. So you have to have already grown. And that's a case of regulatory capture. It means that those who have more power and more resources will get yet more resources, and those that want to start won't. How does that encourage new competition and new innovation? It doesn't.
We'll leave it at that. This could go on for hours and hours, but this has been
more like decades, Mike. It's been going on for decades.
Jeff Jarvis, air quote retired professor, director of Tao Center of Entrepreneurial Journalism at the Newmark School at CUNY, and Steve Waldman, CEO, founder, Rebuild Local News. Thank you, gentlemen, both of you, for your valuable time, your amazingly interesting insights, and for making us feel a little bit worse about the problems.
I will agree with Jeff on something like this. Like, there really is an incredible amount of innovation going on right now. There's a lot of really encouraging things. It's just small compared to where it needs to be
or up Pulaski, Tennessee.
Yeah.
Well, the reason this discussion is important is because none of this is easy. That's the point. Is that we're all trying to look at very difficult questions, and this is the kind of discussion we need to have, Mike. And so thanks.
Thank you, Mike.